Welcome to the Hot News Channel, where we strip away the noise to analyze today's breaking stories. It is Sunday, March 15th, 2026.
Thank you. Glad to be here for this.
Yeah, so I want you to imagine something for a second. Imagine the United States military spends $11.3 billion in just 6 days to bomb an island fortress into absolute dust.
Right.
By traditional, 20th century metrics, that is a portrait of just absolute unchallenged supremacy.
Oh, totally. It's overwhelming force.
Right. But while the smoke clears over the Persian Gulf, you have this multi-million-dollar stealth fighter that's grounded. And it's grounded because its refueling tanker was quietly shot out of the sky by a fractionally cheap ballistic missile.
Yeah, a massive vulnerability.
Exactly. And while the politicians declare victory, half the world's fertilizer is just trapped behind a single geographic bottleneck.
Threatening a global famine. Yeah.
Yes, threatening a famine before the next planting season even begins. So that is why today is a fundamental game changer. I mean, the global paradigm hasn't just shifted.
Yeah.
It has completely fractured.
It really has. We are looking at the violent, real-time obsolescence of military hegemony as we've known it since 1945.
Yeah.
And the mission of this deep dive today is to map exactly how that is happening. Right now, there is just an absolute flood of military assessments, diplomatic dispatches, and financial reports pouring out of the Middle East and Eastern Europe.
It's overwhelming, honestly.
It is. In the fog of a multi-front war involving the United States, Israel, Iran, and Ukraine, the truth almost never makes the headline. The truth is buried in the logistics.
Right, the supply chains.
Exactly, the supply chains and the quiet strategic maneuvers that dictate who actually holds the leverage.
And because we are pulling from such a polarized, heavily fortified spectrum of field reports, I mean, we're talking ranging from Oval Office press releases to independent Middle Eastern analysts, we need to establish the ground rules for today's analysis right now.
Good idea.
Our job is not to tell you who the good guys or the bad guys are. We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the politics, or the ideologies of the original reporters or the state actors involved.
Right. We're just looking at the data.
Exactly. We are cross-referencing highly conflicting narratives to lay the hard math on the table. We are impartially relaying the facts, the casualties, and the economic data to basically uncover the actual strategic reality hiding beneath all the propaganda.
Which is so needed right now. And the terrain we need to map first is the epicenter of this escalation, which is the direct United States military engagement with Iran. We have to start with the target itself.
Kharg Island.
Yeah, Kharg Island.
So the Oval Office released a very specific statement from President Donald Trump detailing that the U.S. Central Command executed a massive sustained bombing raid on Kharg Island.
Right.
Now, the statement described Kharg Island as Iran's crown jewel, claiming that U.S. forces completely obliterated the military targets located there.
But there's a catch there.
A huge catch. There was a fascinating caveat attached to this declaration. The president stated that for reasons of decency, the massive oil infrastructure on the island was purposefully spared.
Right, decency.
Yeah, decency. But he followed that immediately with a threat to completely wipe out that energy infrastructure if Iran interferes with the free passage of ships through the Strait of Hormuz.
You really have to look at the geography of Kharg Island to understand why that specific threat is so loaded.
Okay, unpack that.
Well, Kharg Island isn't just like a random military outpost. It sits about 15 miles off the Iranian coast, and it handles upwards of 90% of all Iranian crude oil exports.
Wow. 90%.
Yeah, it is the beating economic heart of the nation. So the administration is executing what they are calling one of the most powerful bombing raids in modern history, claiming total destruction of the military defense grid, but actively choosing to leave the primary economic engine completely untouched.
Which brings us to the financial toll of this operation, because the numbers coming from the financial dispatches are just staggering.
Oh, they're huge.
Yeah. The United States has spent $11.3 billion in 6 days.
Just let that sink in. 6 days.
Right. Let's break down what that actually pays for. We are talking about thousands of aviation fuel tons, the operational cost of deploying carrier strike groups, the deployment of Tomahawk cruise missiles, which run, a couple of $1 million apiece?
Easily. And the rapid depletion of highly expensive interceptor missiles used to shield the fleet during these operations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You don't spend $11.3 billion in a week just to send a message.
No, you don't. And this is where the official narrative of unchallenged victory encounters extreme analytical friction.
What do you mean by friction?
Well, If we take the statement at face value that every military target on Kharg Island has been obliterated and Iran's defensive capability is neutralized, then the subsequent logistical movements make absolutely no sense.
Oh, you're talking about the troop movements.
Right. Current military deployment reports show between 2,500 and 5,000 U.S. Marines are actively mobilizing and moving via Japan toward the Middle East.
Wait, hold on. A movement of 5,000 Marines from the Pacific Theater?
Yeah.
That is a Marine Expeditionary Brigade. That implies a massive amphibious task force. If the air campaign was so successful, why are they mobilizing thousands of ground troops halfway across the world?
That is the critical anomaly in the data right there. You don't mobilize an amphibious assault force of that magnitude unless you are bracing for a scenario that requires boots on the ground.
Oh, right.
Are we looking at the prelude to a ground invasion of the Iranian coastline or perhaps an occupation of Kharg Island itself?
Oh, wow.
And if we are, the strategic math becomes an absolute nightmare. The Iranian coastline along the Persian Gulf is backed by the Zagros Mountains.
It's rough terrain.
Extremely. It is heavily fortified, littered with deep underground bunkers and mobile anti-ship missile batteries. Attempting an amphibious landing against a prepared, geographically entrenched adversary in the 21st century could result in a catastrophic historic loss of life.
So the bombing campaign might not actually be the decisive victory it's painted as.
Yeah.
If they were prepping ground forces, it means air power alone isn't solving the core problem.
Right. According to the analysis by military expert Daniel Davis, we need to view this through the lens of strategic messaging and, frankly, internal panic.
Panic, really?
Yeah. Davis argues that conspicuously sparing the oil infrastructure while threatening it later isn't a show of restraint, it's a sign of anxiety.
Interesting.
The administration is burning through billions of dollars to project dominance, but the reality on the ground is that the adversary holds massive leverage over the global energy choke points. The massive deployment of Marines suggests a reactionary posture.
Like they're trying to overcompensate.
Exactly. They are trying to signal overwhelming strength, but the logistics indicate they are deeply terrified of losing control of the maritime domain.
But hitting radar installations and dropping bunker busters doesn't just happen in a vacuum. I mean, the adversary doesn't just sit there and absorb an $11.3 billion bombing campaign.
No, they react.
Right. We have to look at how Iran is actually answering back. And they aren't answering back with traditional symmetrical force. They aren't launching fighter jets to meet U.S. fighter jets.
That would be suicide.
Exactly. They're targeting the Achilles heel of the U.S. military apparatus in the region.
The blinding and grounding of U.S. defenses. This is the definition of asymmetric warfare. And it is a piece of the strategic puzzle that is completely buried under the noise of the Kharg Island airstrikes.
Yeah, because the data on U.S. vulnerabilities is severe. According to reporting by the Wall Street Journal, an Iranian ballistic missile strike targeted the Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia.
Right.
This is a massive installation deep in the desert, historically considered a highly secure rear echelon base.
Supposed to be untouchable.
Exactly. But the strike specifically damaged 5 U.S. Air Force KC-135 refueling planes right on the tarmac. Combine that with a previous incident confirmed by CENTCOM, where another refueling tanker crashed over western Iraq, killing all 6 crew members.
Awful.
Yeah. And then we have the intelligence hubs. The U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, a multi-billion-dollar fortress, was struck by kamikaze drones. Field reports confirm these drones specifically targeted and destroyed the CRAM air defense radar mounted on the roof.
Which is just a massive blow.
Total known casualties from these asymmetric strikes currently stand at 13 U.S. service members killed and roughly 200 injured.
You see, the choice of these specific targets is a masterclass in operational disruption. Taking out a KC-135 Stratotanker isn't just destroying a plane, it is severing the circulatory system of the U.S. Air Force.
How so? Like, for people who don't know the logistics.
Well, a KC-135 is essentially a flying gas station. With 7 of these tankers now out of commission across the theater, the operational radius of the entire U.S. fighter fleet shrinks dramatically.
Ah, I see.
An F-35 stealth fighter is an absolute marvel of aeronautical engineering, but it burns fuel at an astronomical rate. Without mid-air refueling capabilities, its time on target, its loiter time is slashed, it becomes tethered to its base.
So it's a logistics strike. It's the equivalent of, like, slashing the tires of the supply convoys rather than trying to penetrate the armor of a main battle tank.
Exactly. And that exact same logic applies to the strike on the Baghdad embassy. The CRAM, the counter-rocket, artillery, and mortar system is what protects that massive complex.
Right.
It relies on a highly sophisticated radar to detect incoming threats and shreds them with a 20-millimeter Gatling gun. By using a cheap, expendable kamikaze drone to blind the radar dish on the roof, the entire defensive umbrella collapses. You can't shoot down what your computer systems can no longer see.
But let's look at the grand scale here. We have a U.S. military operation backed by aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, and an $11.3 billion budget. Does losing a handful of 60-year-old refueling tankers and a radar dish on a roof fundamentally alter the balance of power? I mean, the U.S. still holds absolute uncontested air superiority.
But having air superiority on paper is useless if you cannot project it physically.
Fair point.
According to the analysis by Trita Parsi, what we are witnessing is a doctrine of escalation control. Parsi argues that Iran is executing a meticulously calculated strategy where they refuse to match the U.S. blow for blow in arenas where they are outgunned.
Right, they aren't trying to win a dogfight.
Exactly. They are systematically dismantling the sensory and logistical backbone of the U.S. presence. A drone that costs perhaps $20,000 just neutralized a multi-million-dollar defense grid in Baghdad, leaving an embassy complex that houses thousands of personnel entirely exposed.
Wow.
That is a terrifying cost asymmetry that brute financial force simply cannot solve.
Which forces us to ask the ultimate question about this entire campaign. What is the ultimate political objective? The military is trading blows, attacking logistics and infrastructure, but military action is supposed to serve a political end.
It has to, yeah.
This brings us to the incredibly complex illusion of regime change and leadership decapitation.
Because if you don't have a defined, achievable political goal, you aren't fighting a war. You are just managing a very expensive, very lethal demolition project.
Right. And the hard data regarding the political targets centers on the February 28 strikes. In a massive historic escalation, U.S. strikes killed Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
A huge moment.
Unprecedented. Now, from a purely tactical standpoint, taking out a head of state who has been in power since 1989 is a monumental event. But look at the immediate institutional response.
It was incredibly fast.
Within a matter of days, the Assembly of Experts, the clerical body responsible for succession, convened and appointed his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, as the new supreme leader.
Seamless transition.
Completely. In the wake of this, the U.S. State Department offered a $10 million reward for information regarding the whereabouts of the new supreme leader and the National Security Council chief, Ali Larijani.
Right.
Yet, in a closed-door briefing to Congress, Senator Chris Murphy explicitly stated that the official war goals do not involve destroying Iran's nuclear weapons program, and regime change is officially not on the list of objectives.
That briefing exposes a glaring, fundamental strategic contradiction at the heart of the campaign. The United States just spent billions of dollars, risked a regional conflagration, and absorbed American casualties to assassinate the supreme leader of a hostile nation. But if the stated goal is not regime change, and the regime's infrastructure remains completely intact, seamlessly transferring ultimate authority to the son, what was the strategic value of the assassination?
Well, I have to imagine the theory is that removing a figurehead who has consolidated power for over 3 decades deeply destabilizes the internal command structure.
You'd think so.
Doesn't taking out the ultimate authority figure create a power vacuum? Doesn't it breed paranoia and chaos within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps?
It makes logical sense on paper, but decapitation strikes in deeply entrenched, ideologically driven regimes are less like cutting the head off a snake and more like cutting off the arm of a starfish.
Well, I like that analogy.
Thanks.
Yeah.
The organism doesn't die, it regenerates, and typically it regenerates with the hardest, most resilient, and most radical elements taking absolute control.
Right. The hardliners take over.
Exactly. Historical precedent shows that decapitation strikes almost never result in institutional collapse. They eliminate the moderate voices who might have argued for restraint, and they solidify a hardliner dominance. The system closes ranks.
And we are actually seeing that exact psychological resilience playing out on the ground. Field reports confirmed that Ali Larijani, the National Security Council chief, with a $10 million U.S. bounty currently on his head, was seen walking freely on the streets of Tehran.
Unbelievable.
No visible security detail, out in the open during an active U.S. bombing campaign, directly taunting U.S. officials.
That is a deliberate, highly calculated projection of state confidence. It is a broadcast to the Iranian public and to the Pentagon that the system survives.
Right.
It says, we are not hiding in bunkers, your intelligence is flawed, and your multi-billion-dollar campaign has not paralyzed our leadership. It renders the assassination politically inert, even if it was a tactical military success.
So we have a military stalemate in the Gulf and a decapitation strike that failed to fracture the political apparatus. But this friction isn't contained to the Middle East.
No, it's global.
It is bleeding directly into the global economy and creating shock waves that are going to fundamentally alter the supply chains that keep the modern world functioning. Let's examine the economic chokehold.
Because the vulnerability of the West isn't just in its military logistics, it's in its complete reliance on uninterrupted maritime trade.
Here is the brutal economic data. The Strait of Hormuz is effectively shut down. There are currently roughly 1,000 commercial ships trapped in the Persian Gulf, unable to safely navigate the bottleneck.
1,000 ships.
1,000. Of those, 200 are massive oil tankers. As an immediate result, global crude oil prices have surged past $100 a barrel.
Which hurts everyone.
Right. But according to the analysis by Danny Haifong, there's a massive geopolitical twist to this blockade. Iran has signaled it will allow a limited number of these trapped tankers to pass through the strait safely, but only under one condition. The cargo must be compensated for in Chinese yuan.
That is huge. That is not a simple trade dispute. That is a targeted structural attack on the petrodollar system.
Explain the petrodollar connection.
For decades, global oil has been priced and traded in U.S. dollars. This creates a perpetual artificial global demand for the dollar, which allows the United States to run massive deficits and fund its military without triggering hyperinflation.
Right, because everyone needs dollars to buy oil.
Exactly. By weaponizing the geography of the Strait of Hormuz to force the use of the Chinese yuan, Iran is actively attempting to dismantle the financial architecture of American hegemony.
But, the focus on oil and the dollar is actually blinding us to the true existential threat here. According to a comprehensive analysis by World Affairs, in context, the media is missing the real catastrophe.
The fertilizer.
Yes. They report that 1.3 million tons of fertilizer are exported through the Strait of Hormuz every single month. That single supply line accounts for nearly 1/3 of the global nitrogen fertilizer trade and half of the entire world's sulfur supply.
This is the hidden mechanism of modern civilization that we take entirely for granted. Human survival currently relies on the Haber-Bosch process.
Right, the industrial procedure.
Yes, the procedure that takes atmospheric nitrogen and binds it with hydrogen from natural gas to create ammonia, which is then turned into the urea fertilizer that farmers spread on their fields. It is a massively energy-intensive process, and the Gulf region completely dominates it.
So it's a cascading failure. If the energy prices spike, it costs more to actually manufacture the fertilizer. But if the fertilizer itself is physically tracked behind a naval blockade, we aren't just talking about inflation at the grocery store.
No, we are talking about absolute catastrophic crop failures. We are approaching the global planting season. Nations like India and Brazil are agricultural juggernauts. They feed billions of people.
Right.
But their soils require massive inputs of imported nitrogen. If that 1.3 million tons of fertilizer does not leave the Gulf, crop yields in the global south will collapse. We are looking down the barrel of a manufactured global famine.
Wait, if the stakes are that high, if 1/3 of the world's fertilizer is sitting behind a single shut door, why doesn't the international community simply kick the door in?
It's not that simple.
Well, President Trump has explicitly stated he expects international allies like China, Japan, and France to send their warships to the Gulf to force the Strait of Hormuz open. If the global food supply is on the line, surely a coalition fleet would intervene to clear the bottleneck.
That assumes the geopolitical incentives of those allies align with Washington, which they no longer do. Let's look at China.
Why?
China has spent years trying to internationalize the yuan and bypass the U.S. financial system. Iran's mandate that tankers pay in yuan actively accelerates Beijing's long-term goal of de-dollarization. Why would the Chinese Navy risk their vessels to stop a blockade that is forcibly strengthening their own currency?
Wow, good point. And the European allies?
European allies are paralyzed by domestic pressure and military reality. Field reports recently confirmed that France lost an officer in Iraq due to an asymmetric strike. European populations have zero appetite for a Middle Eastern war.
Right.
Furthermore, forcing the Strait of Hormuz isn't a simple policing action. It is a 21-mile-wide channel at its narrowest point. It is shallow, it can be heavily mined, and the surrounding coastline is bristling with cheap, highly lethal anti-ship cruise missiles.
It's a trap.
Sending multi-billion-dollar destroyers into a geographic kill zone to protect commercial shipping is a risk profile that allies like France and Japan are simply refusing to accept.
So the economic chokehold remains unbroken. You have a superpower dropping billions in ordnance, while the adversary quietly shuts a geographic door and threatens to starve the global agricultural system.
It's chilling.
But while this strategic stalemate solidifies in the Gulf, we have to shift our focus westward to the Levant, because the proxy and allied fronts are unleashing an unprecedented level of physical devastation. Let's talk about the expanding inferno across Israel and Lebanon.
This is where the abstract concepts of military doctrine translate into horrific generational trauma on the ground.
The hard data coming out of the northern front is exceptionally grim. According to the analysis by Eylon Levy, the rocket barrages being fired by Hezbollah into northern Israel are the most intense and sustained since the 2006 Lebanon war.
And their tech has improved.
Significantly.
Yeah.
What is particularly notable is the shift in capability. They are heavily utilizing advanced domestic manufacturing hubs, deeply embedded in areas like Beirut's Dahi district.
Right.
Furthermore, we are seeing reports that Iranian-backed forces are utilizing cluster munitions weapons, specifically designed for massive area denial that scatter explosive submunitions over a 10-mile radius.
Terrifying.
In response, the Israeli offensive into Lebanon has resulted in severe civilian devastation. The numbers currently show 600 people killed, 1,400 wounded, and a staggering 750,000 civilians internally displaced.
And we are seeing the brutal nature of this tit-for-tat escalation extend deep into sovereign Iranian territory as well.
Yeah, the tragedy in Manab, Iran, highlights exactly that.
Yeah.
A double-tap strike struck a local school.
Which is just awful to even think about.
For context, for those listening, a double-tap strike is a highly controversial tactic where location is bombed and then a second munition hits the exact same location a few minutes later, frequently killing the first responders who rush in to help.
Yeah.
In Manab, this strike killed 165 10-year-old girls and staff members. Now, adhering to our mandate to cross-reference narratives impartially, President Trump claimed that Iran accidentally hit their own school with a misfired domestic weapon.
Right, that was the official statement.
However, multiple regional analysts and independent observers attribute the tragedy to a coordinated U.S. or Israeli covert strike. And the covert nature of this war brings us to the intelligence cited by the Electronic Intifada regarding a deeply unsettling operation in Nebuchadnezzar, Lebanon.
Right, this was wild.
Israeli commandos allegedly infiltrated the territory disguised as medical personnel and Lebanese army soldiers. Their objective was to dig up a local cemetery, searching for the remains of a long-missing Israeli pilot, Ron Arad.
The tactical decisions here, from the scale of the bombardments to the infiltration methods, require us to dissect the underlying military doctrines being employed, starting with what is commonly referred to as the Dahiya doctrine.
Right.
Analyzed extensively by Mohammed Morandi and Katie Halper, this doctrine fundamentally relies on the intentional application of massive, disproportionate force against civilian and state infrastructure.
So punishing the civilians.
Exactly. The core psychological theory is that if you inflict a level of pain and destruction that the civilian population simply cannot bear, they will eventually turn against the militant elements embedded within their society. You make the cost of harboring Hezbollah too high for the Lebanese people to tolerate.
But looking at the historical and current data, does dropping apartment blocks actually pacify a population? Because human psychology usually dictates that when your neighborhood is leveled, you don't blame the militant hiding in the basement. You blame the pilot dropping the bomb.
That is the crucial flaw. The analysis strongly indicates that the Dahiya doctrine is a profound strategic failure. Instead of fracturing the society and turning the population against Hezbollah or the Iranian government, the bombardment is galvanizing them.
Unifying them.
Yes. Shared catastrophic trauma is an incredible unifier. It breeds intense intergenerational radicalization, not political compliance.
But let's look at the absolute reality facing Israel's defense establishment. They are dealing with an existential, multi-front security threat.
Absolutely.
When cluster munitions are scattering unexploded ordnance across a 10-mile radius in your northern communities, making vast swaths of your country uninhabitable, a severe, overwhelming response is often viewed as the only mathematical way to reestablish deterrence. They have to neutralize the launch sites to protect their own civilians.
The severity of the security threat to Israel is undeniable. But the long-term viability of their strategic response is deeply questionable on two fronts.
Okay, what's the first?
First is the pure mathematics of a war of attrition. Israel relies on incredibly sophisticated, highly expensive interceptor systems to shield its population, but you cannot fight a multi-year war if you are rapidly depleting multi-million-dollar interceptors to shoot down rockets that cost a few $1,000s to weld together in a basement.
The economics don't work out.
The burn rate of their defensive inventory is entirely unsustainable. Second is the erosion of international legal norms. Operations like the infiltration of Nebuchadnezzar, where commandos disguise themselves as medics, constitute the crime of perfidy under international humanitarian law.
Right, because if you disguise yourself as a medic to conduct a military operation, you are destroying the protected status of actual medical workers. The next time a real ambulance shows up, the enemy assumes it's a strike team and opens fire.
Precisely. It destroys the foundational trust required for humanitarian operations. And relying on tactics that systematically violate these norms severely alienates the international community.
It pushes allies away.
Yeah. You might achieve a short-term tactical goal, like searching a cemetery, but you degrade your long-term diplomatic survival and isolate yourself from the global allies you rely on for ammunition and political cover.
Which transitions us perfectly into the internal structural consequences of this prolonged state of war.
Yeah.
Because it isn't just buildings being destroyed. The physical destruction is forcing a profound historical demographic reshaping of the entire region. Let's look at the data driving this demographic war of attrition.
Demographics are the silent, slow-moving glacier that ultimately determines the victor in any protracted intergenerational conflict.
Well, the demographic shifts we are tracking right now are staggering. According to demographic expert Sergio Della Pergola, whose findings are corroborated by reports analyzed by Due Dissidence, Israel is currently experiencing a historic mass exodus.
The numbers are shocking.
In the year 2025 alone, data shows that nearly 70,000 Israelis left the country, while only 19,000 returned. Over the past 24 months, the total outflow of citizens has surpassed 150,000.
No.
Contrast that massive outward migration with the deeply entrenched reality in the Palestinian territories. Field reports indicate that Palestinians in heavily bombarded, obliterated neighborhoods like Al-Shujaya in northern Gaza are actively refusing to leave the ruins of their homes despite extreme deprivation.
You are looking at the collision of two fundamentally different concepts of societal endurance.
What do you mean?
On one side, you have the Palestinian concept of sumud, which translates to steadfastness. It is the ideological commitment to remain on the land regardless of the physical destruction around them.
Right.
On the other side, you have a highly mobile, deeply integrated dual citizen population.
And we also have to factor in the escalating situation in the West Bank, which is accelerating this polarization. Based on Wally Rashid's reporting, violence in the West Bank is surging. We are seeing armed settlers utilizing U.S.-funded M16 assault rifles that were actively distributed by National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, attacking Palestinian residents.
And the legal system there is entirely split.
Completely. The judicial disparity regarding this violence is stark and highly documented. The conviction rate for settlers involved in these attacks is less than 1%. In contrast, the conviction rate for Palestinians tried within the military court system sits at roughly 99%.
Incredible disparity.
Meanwhile, the humanitarian blockade continues, with Middle East Eye reporting absolute food shortages and exorbitant survival-level prices in Gaza during the holy month of Ramadan due to the total closure of commercial crossings.
If we synthesize this data to understand state survival, the exodus of 150,000 Israelis is the most critical metric.
Why that specifically?
The Zionist project, at its economic core, relies on maintaining a robust, highly developed economy. The people boarding flights out of Ben Gurion Airport are not a random cross-section of society. It is largely the secular, highly educated, tech-driven middle class.
The brain drain.
Yes. It is the Silicon Valley expats, the doctors, the cybersecurity engineers. When the demographic cohort that possesses international mobility and dual passports decides the security situation is untenable, they leave. And when they leave, they take the tax base, the foreign investment, and the technological edge with them. It threatens the very economic foundation of the state.
So while the military is fighting a kinetic war on the northern and southern borders, the economic engine of the country is quietly boarding international flights and relocating to Europe and the United States.
And when you combine that capital flight with the ongoing strategy in the West Bank, which analysts view as the de facto annexation facilitated by state-supplied weaponry and settler violence, you drastically accelerate global diplomatic isolation.
Because allies can't defend it.
Exactly. Even traditional, steadfast Western allies find it politically impossible to defend a dual-tiered legal architecture where conviction rates are 1% for one demographic and 99% for another. The state rots from the inside out while fighting on its borders.
The regional inferno is horrific, but we have to understand how this impacts the macro geopolitical reality. Because the United States isn't just bogged down in the Persian Gulf and navigating the crisis in the Levant. We have to zoom out and examine the forgotten front, the conflict that initiated this global fracture.
Eastern Europe.
Yes, Eastern Europe.
The graveyard of empires and the absolute paralysis of the Western diplomatic system.
We need to bring in the comprehensive analysis by Dr. Arthur Kachikian. His thesis is chilling. He argues that we are not just observing a series of unfortunate regional wars, we're actively witnessing the definitive terminal end of the post-1945 international law system.
It's all system.
The whole thing. He points directly to the death of the vital stabilizing arms control treaties that kept the Cold War from turning hot. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, dead. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, dead. The Open Skies Agreement, gone.
All the guardrails are removed.
To ground this in historical context, Kachikian points out a sobering statistic. 59,000 Americans died in Vietnam, 4,000 in Iraq, and 2,500 in Afghanistan. And yet, despite the catastrophic lessons of those interventions, current global leaders are publicly and casually utilizing religious Armageddon rhetoric to justify current escalations.
And while the U.S. focuses its immense military bandwidth, its naval assets, and billions of dollars on the Middle East, the situation in Ukraine is deteriorating into a paralyzing stalemate.
According to Ivan Kachanovsky's detailed analysis, Ukraine's political and military structure is in a state of deep paralysis. President Zelensky's official electoral term has expired. To maintain the grinding war effort against Russian forces, his government is relying entirely on forced mobilization.
And the demographic cost there is also huge.
Devastating. 2 million Ukrainian men are currently documented as wanted for draft dodging, actively hiding from recruitment officers, and an additional 200,000 are officially classified as military deserters.
That's a massive portion of the population.
Furthermore, vital back-channel U.S.-Russia peace talks have been completely paused. Why? Because U.S. diplomatic and military attention is entirely consumed by the multi-front escalation with Iran and Israel, leaving the European Union struggling to essentially fund Ukraine's public sector and pay its pensions just to keep the state from totally collapsing.
This is the grand strategic failure of the current era. The United States is suffering from what political scientists define as an asymmetry of interest and legitimacy.
Break that down for us.
It means you can possess the unparalleled firepower to bomb a nation's military targets into ash from 30,000 feet, but you cannot govern that nation from afar. You cannot force a local population to accept an outcome they view as fundamentally illegitimate. The lesson of Vietnam, the lesson of Iraq, the lesson of Afghanistan is always exactly the same. Brute force cannot solve a political deficit.
Let me argue the counterpoint here, looking at the sheer scope of operations. Doesn't the fact that the U.S. is simultaneously arming and funding Ukraine, shielding Israel with anti-ballistic missile cruisers, and launching $11.3 billion strike packages against Iran prove the absolute unmatched global reach of the American military? It demonstrates an ability to project power on 3 distinct fronts simultaneously.
On a spreadsheet, yes, it shows reach. In reality, it shows an empire that is dangerously, perhaps terminally overextended.
Overextended?
Yes, it reveals a superpower trapped in a grinding World War I-style proxy war in the frozen trenches of Europe, while simultaneously blundering into an unwinnable, asymmetric, high-tech quagmire in the Middle East. And Kachikian argues that this multi-front overextension is not driven by rational, stabilizing diplomacy. It is fueled by defense industry lobbyists, political inertia, and a fundamental refusal to acknowledge that the unipolar moment has ended.
Right.
And that brings us to the most terrifying reality of this overextension, nuclear proliferation.
The death of the treaties. Because when the treaties die, the guardrails disappear.
When you terminate the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, you allow the deployment of hypersonic missiles right on the borders of your adversaries. Flight times from launch to impact are reduced to barely 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
There is no time for diplomacy. There is barely time for radar verification. Kachikian notes that during the height of the Cold War, an era where we actually had functional treaties, communication hotlines, and mutual inspections under open skies, there were still over 160 documented cases of accidental near-nuclear war.
I remember reading about those. It's terrifying.
160 times where a radar glitch, a flock of geese, or a computer error almost triggered Armageddon. Today, with 0 treaties, multiple overlapping active conflict zones, and leaders casually invoking apocalyptic rhetoric. While the mathematical risk of a miscalculation leading to an accidental nuclear exchange is exponentially higher than it was at the peak of the Soviet era.
Wow. We have mapped an immense amount of terrain today, moving from the $11.3 billion airstrikes on Kharg Island to the vulnerability of the global fertilizer supply, the demographic exodus in Israel, and the paralysis of the war in Ukraine.
It's a lot to process.
It is. It is time to distill this immense flood of data down. In the midst of this fog of war, what is the single most important element the listener needs to remember from this deep dive?
The vital takeaway is that the traditional 20th century metrics of victory are entirely obsolete. The removal of a political figurehead through a targeted decapitation strike and the obliteration of military targets with billion-dollar bombing raids do not equate to a strategic victory.
Right.
Not when the adversary has successfully utilized asymmetric warfare to blind your multi-million-dollar defense systems with cheap drones, and certainly not when they possess the geographic leverage to choke off the global food and energy supply chains. Asymmetric warfare, demographic steadfastness, and supply chain manipulation have effectively neutralized traditional brute force military supremacy.
If you found this analysis valuable, hit the plus or follow button on your podcast app and give us a like. Subscribe to the Hot News channel for more deep dives. Until we meet again, goodbye.
But before you sign off, we want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over. If a nation's true security is no longer dictated by the number of stealth bombers it can put in the air, but by its physical control over essential lifelines, the microchips, the crude oil, and the nitrogen fertilizer that literally feeds its population, what happens next?
Exactly.
What happens when the nations of the global south, watching this overextension unfold in real time, realize they no longer need to rely on the Western financial system to trade these vital commodities among themselves? You have to ask yourself, are we currently watching the successful defense of the old post-1945 world order, or are we witnessing the violent, chaotic birth pangs of a completely decentralized globe? Think about that.